On the morning of July 18, 1994, hotel staff entered room 214 at a lakeside resort near Traverse City, Michigan. After checkout time came and went. The bed had been slept in. One suitcase was open on the floor. A half-written postcard sat beside the television. The bride's wedding ring was on the bathroom counter. But 24-year-old Emily Carter was gone. Her husband, Daniel, told deputies she had walked out before sunrise to watch the water and never came back. There were no signs of a struggle. No blood. No broken furniture. No witnesses who remembered seeing a pregnant woman leave the property. 19 years later, while clearing out Daniel's garage after he moved to Arizona, his younger sister found an old wedding album tucked inside a cardboard box labeled Christmas decorations. The photographs looked normal. Until she noticed that one picture had been replaced. No one could explain who had put it there. Or why that single photograph had never been mentioned during the original investigation. The discovery forced detectives to reopen a case most people believed would never move again. Because if that photograph had always been inside the album, someone had lied from the very beginning. Emily and Daniel had married only 4 days before the disappearance. Friends described them as ordinary. They had met at a community college outside Grand Rapids. Emily worked as a dental assistant. Daniel installed garage doors with his uncle's construction company. They rented a small duplex, drove a used Chevrolet Cavalier, and spent weekends fixing up furniture they found at garage sales. Only close family members knew Emily was about 12 weeks pregnant. She wanted to wait until after the honeymoon before telling everyone else. According to both families, the trip to northern Michigan had been her idea. Neither of them could afford anything expensive. The resort overlooked a quiet stretch of Lake Michigan where tourists mostly came to fish, hike, and watch sunsets. The couple checked in on July 16. Employees remembered them because Emily carried a disposable camera almost everywhere. She photographed the lobby, the shoreline, the wooden dock, even their breakfast. The camera was never found. Daniel later told investigators it must have disappeared with her. The first 2 days seemed completely ordinary. Receipts showed they ate at local diners. They rented bicycles. They bought postcards from a gift shop. One cashier remembered Emily laughing because Daniel kept getting lost on unfamiliar roads. Nothing suggested trouble. Then everything changed before sunrise on the 18th. Daniel claimed he woke around 6:30 and realized Emily was missing. He told deputies the bathroom light was on. Her sandals were gone. Her light jacket was missing too. Her purse remained inside the room. So did her prenatal vitamins. Her wallet. Her driver's license. Nearly $600 in cash remained inside an envelope in the dresser. Investigators searched the shoreline first. Divers entered the water that afternoon. Search dogs covered nearby woods. Volunteers walked miles of trails. Nothing. No footprints. No clothing. No camera. No body. The resort had no security cameras. In 1994, that wasn't unusual. Guests came and went without leaving much of a record. Detectives interviewed every employee. One housekeeper thought she saw a woman matching Emily's description walking toward the parking lot just after dawn. Another employee insisted the woman was heading toward the beach. Neither witness sounded confident. Both admitted they only caught a brief glance. The timeline quickly became uncertain. Daniel cooperated with investigators. He repeated his story several times. It hardly changed. He admitted they argued the night before but described it as something small. Emily wanted to visit a nearby lighthouse before driving home. He wanted to leave early to avoid traffic. Neither family thought that disagreement mattered. Married couples argued. Nothing about it explained a disappearance. Phone records complicated things. At 9:47 p.m. the night before Emily vanished, someone from their room called the front desk. The conversation lasted just 18 seconds. The clerk who answered could never remember what was said. She only remembered hearing a woman's voice. No notes were taken. The recording system automatically erased calls after 30 days. Whatever Emily said disappeared with it. Investigators focused on Daniel anyway. It was standard procedure. His clothes tested negative for blood. His truck showed no evidence of a crime. Friends described him as quiet, dependable, sometimes stubborn, but never violent. Police searched the couple's home. Nothing unusual appeared. No hidden debts. No life insurance policy that would create an obvious motive. No evidence Emily planned to disappear. Weeks turned into months. The case slowly lost momentum. Then a letter arrived at the sheriff's office. It had no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping about Emily's disappearance. Across the top, someone had written in blue ink, You asked the wrong husband. There were no fingerprints. The handwriting couldn't be matched to anyone investigators interviewed. Many assumed it was another cruel prank. Still, detectives reviewed every statement again. One interview suddenly stood out. A maintenance worker remembered seeing a dark green pickup truck parked behind the motel just before sunrise. He originally believed it belonged to a fisherman. By the time investigators followed up, months had passed. No one could identify the truck. The lead quietly died. Years passed. Emily's parents continued organizing annual searches. Each anniversary brought newspaper articles and brief television coverage. Someone always claimed to have seen her in another state. Every tip ended the same way. Wrong person. False memory. Dead end. By 2005, the investigation had been transferred twice. Boxes of reports sat in storage. Several original detectives had retired. One had died. Evidence was misplaced during an office renovation. The case slowly became another unsolved file gathering dust. Then, in the spring of 2013, Daniel decided to sell the house where he had lived since the late 1990s. His younger sister, Melissa, volunteered to help clean the garage. Most boxes contained holiday decorations, old tools, and photo albums. One cardboard box looked untouched for years. Inside was the wedding album everyone remembered. Melissa flipped through it out of curiosity. Family portraits. The ceremony. The reception. The drive north. Then she reached a photograph she had never seen before. Emily stood beside a gas station payphone. She wasn't smiling. She was looking over her shoulder. And in the reflection of the station's front window, barely visible behind her, stood a man no one in either family recognized. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you like this story. The photograph measured 4 by 6 inches, the same size as every other print in the album. Nothing about the paper looked unusual. It had aged the same way. The colors had faded at the same rate. If someone had inserted it years later, they had somehow found photo paper from the same processing lab and matched nearly 2 decades of wear. Melissa showed the album to her mother that evening. She stared at the picture for nearly a minute before saying something that surprised everyone. I've never seen this one. Neither had Emily's parents. Neither had Daniel. At least, that was what he told detectives when they contacted him in Arizona. He insisted the disposable camera had disappeared with Emily. He said he had no idea where that photograph came from. The original case file supported part of his statement. In 1994, investigators had written that no honeymoon photographs had ever been recovered. Yet the album contained more than 60 prints from the trip. Someone had clearly developed the film. The obvious question was simple. Detectives tracked down the photo lab printed on the back of each picture. The business had closed years earlier. Its records had been destroyed after bankruptcy. There were no customer logs. No negatives. No receipts. The trail ended there. But modern forensic imaging offered something investigators never had in 1994. The photograph was scanned at extremely high resolution. The reflection inside the convenience store window became slightly clearer. Emily stood beside the payphone holding what appeared to be folded road maps. Behind the glass stood a tall man wearing a baseball cap and a dark denim jacket. His face remained distorted by the reflection. But one detail stood out immediately. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking directly at Emily. The investigators compared the man's height against the door frame. Approximately 6'3". Far taller than Daniel, who stood just under 5'10". The gas station itself became the next mystery. There was no address visible. Only part of a red fuel sign. A faded soda advertisement. And the edge of a highway marker. Retired Detective Harold Mason volunteered to look through the old evidence one more time. He had worked the case during its first year. Most of the boxes contained little that hadn't already been reviewed dozens of times. Then he found a folded tourist map. One corner had been circled with blue ink. The circle surrounded a small gas station nearly 30 miles south of the resort. Investigators had apparently collected the map from the motel room. No report explained why that location had been marked. Even stranger, no officer had ever visited it. The oversight had gone unnoticed for 19 years. The gas station no longer existed. A larger convenience store occupied the property. But the former owner was still alive. He was 78 and living outside Cadillac, Michigan. When detectives showed him the photograph, he adjusted his glasses and studied it carefully. I remember her. Those 3 words immediately changed the direction of the investigation. He explained that young couples stopped there every summer. Most blended together. Emily hadn't. She had asked if the payphone accepted calling cards. He remembered because she looked upset. Not frightened. Upset. She had made a call lasting several minutes. Then she walked back toward a small blue car parked near the side of the building. Detectives interrupted him. A blue car? He nodded. It wasn't the fellow she came in with. The old man had always assumed she was traveling with someone else. He remembered seeing a taller man leaning against the driver's door. He couldn't describe the man's face. Only that he wore sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. The owner believed they drove away together. That statement directly contradicted Daniel's timeline. According to him, they had never stopped at that gas station. He insisted they drove straight from Grand Rapids to the resort with only one fuel stop much farther south. Credit card receipts seemed to support him. But Emily had paid cash for several purchases during the trip. Cash left almost no trail. Investigators searched old highway maps. The gas station sat along a scenic route tourists often used instead of the interstate. Taking that road would have added nearly 45 minutes to the drive. Why would they choose it? Or had Emily traveled there without Daniel? Another forgotten witness emerged after local news covered the reopened case. A retired waitress from a diner 2 miles from the gas station contacted detectives. She said she distinctly remembered serving a young pregnant woman and 2 men during the summer of 1994. She couldn't remember the exact date. Only that the woman barely touched her food. One man did most of the talking. The other hardly spoke at all. She remembered thinking the quiet man looked uncomfortable. Detectives showed her old driver's license photographs. She pointed to Daniel immediately. Then she shook her head. The taller one isn't here. Asked whether Emily appeared scared, the waitress hesitated. No. She chose her next words carefully. She looked like she was trying to make up her mind. That distinction mattered. Until then, investigators had assumed Emily was either abducted or had disappeared unexpectedly. The waitress described someone wrestling with a decision. Not someone in immediate danger. The problem was timing. There was no receipt. No surveillance footage. Nothing placing that lunch before or after the honeymoon began. The memory stood alone. Useful but impossible to verify. Detectives returned to the photograph again. This time they enlarged the reflection behind the mysterious man. Near his feet, barely visible through the glass, sat a rotating postcard rack. Most cards were blurred beyond recognition. Except one. It showed a white lighthouse standing on a rocky shoreline. Investigators identified it within hours. It wasn't near the resort. It wasn't even on their planned route. The lighthouse stood nearly 90 miles away. And according to a brochure recovered from the motel room back in 1994, it was the one place Emily had circled with the handwritten note. Don't let me forget. Detectives drove to the lighthouse the next morning. The landscape had changed over 19 years. The parking lot had been expanded. The old gift shop was gone. A new visitor center stood where a gravel picnic area once overlooked the water. At first it seemed like another dead end. Then a park employee mentioned that most of the old maintenance records had never been digitized. Boxes of logbooks were still stored in a basement archive. The entries were routine. Weather conditions. Broken railings. Lost property. Medical calls. One notebook from July 1994 contained a single page that caught an investigator's attention. July 17, 9:18 a.m. Young woman reported leaving personal photo album on bench near South Overlook. Album recovered before noon. Claimed by female approximately 1 hour later. There was no name. Just a brief description. No one had connected the report to Emily because the missing persons investigation didn't begin until the next day. The timing fit almost perfectly. Someone had briefly misplaced a photo album. The same album that would later contain the mysterious photograph. Detectives immediately wanted to know one thing. Who returned it? The logbook identified the employee only as R. Miller. Richard Miller was 81 years old and living in a retirement community outside Petoskey. His memory had faded, but when investigators placed the old logbook in front of him, something came back almost immediately. I remember the album. He said it had been sitting alone on a wooden bench overlooking the lake. He flipped through it while waiting for someone to claim it. Wedding pictures. Smiling relatives. Flowers. Nothing unusual. About 45 minutes later, a young woman hurried into the office asking whether anyone had found it. He believed she was newly married because she kept apologizing and still wore her wedding ring. When detectives showed him Emily's photograph, he nodded. I'm pretty sure that's her. Then he added something that wasn't in the logbook. She wasn't alone. Richard remembered another man walking several steps behind her. Not her husband. He was certain of that. What? because he distinctly remembered thinking they looked nothing alike. The taller man never entered the office. He stayed outside near the door, watching. Richard assumed he was simply waiting. He never thought to mention him. No one had ever asked. Detectives compared Richard's description with the reflection in the gas station photograph. Tall, broad shoulders, dark baseball cap, denim jacket. Again, the details aligned. But there was still no identity. The reopened investigation generated national media coverage. Within weeks, hundreds of tips arrived. Most led nowhere. Then one email stood out. It came from a retired truck driver in Ohio. He attached no evidence. Only a short message. "I think I saw the man you're looking for in 1994. Investigators called him the same afternoon. He explained that he had been delivering building materials across northern Michigan that summer. The news report reminded him of something he had never forgotten. He stopped at a roadside diner on July 17th. While fueling his truck afterward, he noticed a young pregnant woman arguing with a tall man beside a blue sedan. She wasn't screaming. She kept pointing toward the highway. The man shook his head. Then another vehicle pulled into the lot. A white Chevrolet Cavalier. The woman immediately stopped talking. She climbed into the passenger seat of the Cavalier and left. The blue sedan drove away in the opposite direction. The truck driver had never seen any of them again. Investigators asked why the memory stayed with him for nearly 2 decades. His answer was simple. The woman looked relieved when the second car arrived. That detail raised even more questions. If the Cavalier was Daniel's car, why had Emily been standing with another man in the first place? Detectives requested every statement Daniel had ever given. Across 6 interviews, one sentence appeared repeatedly. "Emily never left my sight except when she went into restrooms." If the truck driver's memory was accurate, that statement couldn't be true. When confronted, Daniel remained calm. He denied ever separating during the trip. He suggested the witness was confusing them with another couple. The detective asked about the blue sedan. Daniel shrugged. "I've never owned one." His answers were consistent. But consistency alone didn't prove honesty. Investigators decided to examine something largely ignored in 1994. Telephone records. Not calls from the motel. Calls made before the honeymoon. Cell phones were uncommon. Almost everything happened through landlines and payphones. Emily's home phone records had survived because her parents had kept old financial documents in their attic. Most numbers belonged to family, work, or friends. One number appeared 7 times during the month before the wedding. Always late at night. Always lasting less than 3 minutes. The number had never been identified. In 1994, detectives requested subscriber information. The phone company responded that it belonged to a public payphone outside a grocery store in Muskegon. The lead went nowhere. 19 years later, investigators looked beyond the payphone itself. Old municipal records showed something the original detectives had never considered. Just 20 feet from that payphone was a small office that rented private mailboxes. The business kept customer applications for years before closing. Most had been discarded. One filing cabinet survived because it had been purchased by a local auction house after the business shut down. A volunteer helping catalog its contents found several forgotten folders still inside. One application was dated June 1994. The renter had used a post office box instead of a home address. The handwriting was neat. The signature was difficult to read. But investigators noticed something else before they even tried to decipher the name. Under emergency contact, the applicant had written only 2 words. Emily Carter. The application had never been part of the original case. No one in 1994 knew it existed. The mailbox business had changed owners twice before closing. When the last owner auctioned off the remaining furniture, one locked filing cabinet had been sold without anyone checking its contents. Now it sat inside the evidence room. Investigators handled the application carefully. The signature was almost unreadable. At first glance it looked like M. Harris. A forensic document examiner spent hours comparing individual letters. The final opinion was cautious. The last name was probably not Harris at all. It was most likely Harlan. The first name remained impossible to determine. The renter had presented a Michigan driver's license when opening the mailbox. Unfortunately, the clerk had only written the license number. No photocopy had been made. Detectives contacted the Secretary of State. Old licensing records from the early 1990s still existed on microfilm. The number belonged to a man named Michael Harlan, age 33 in 1994. His last known address was a rented house outside Muskegon. The address no longer existed. The property had been demolished after a fire in 2001. Investigators learned that Michael Harlan had worked as a regional sales representative for a company that serviced vending machines across western Michigan. His route regularly took him through Grand Rapids, Traverse City, Petoskey, and dozens of small towns in between. He spent much of his week driving, staying in motels, using payphones. No criminal record appeared. No outstanding warrants. Nothing suggesting violence. Then detectives discovered something else. His employment file included a photocopy of his company identification badge. The picture wasn't high quality, but he was unusually tall. 6'3". The same height estimated from the reflection in the gas station window. They showed the badge photograph to Richard Miller, the retired park employee. He stared at it silently. "I can't swear to it." He leaned closer. "But I think that's him." It wasn't enough for an arrest. It wasn't even enough to officially identify the man in the photograph. But it was the strongest lead the investigation had produced in 19 years. The next question came quickly. Where was Michael Harlan? The answer surprised everyone. He had died in November 1998. A single vehicle crash on a county road outside Kalamazoo. No passengers. No alcohol. No suspicious circumstances. His death had attracted almost no attention. Detectives shifted their focus to the people who had known him. His parents were both deceased. He had never married. No children. Only one younger brother remained alive. Thomas Harlan agreed to meet investigators. He described Michael as private, always traveling for work, always carrying a camera. He took pictures of everything: roads, buildings, random people, old barns, family vacations. Boxes and boxes of photographs filled his basement. Thomas had inherited them after Michael's death. He admitted he had never looked through most of them. There were just too many. The detectives exchanged a glance. Less than 48 hours later, they were sitting in Thomas's garage. Plastic storage bins lined one wall. Every bin contained envelopes of developed photographs arranged by month. Michael had dated almost every packet. July 1994 was there. The envelope felt unusually thick. Inside were more than 100 prints. Gas stations, highways, Lake Michigan, road signs, tourist attractions. Nothing obviously connected to Emily. Then one detective stopped turning pages. He slowly slid a photograph onto the table. It showed the same lakeside resort where Emily and Daniel had spent their honeymoon. The date stamp in the corner read July 17, 1994. The angle suggested it had been taken from inside a parked vehicle across the road. The hotel entrance was visible. So was part of the parking lot. Investigators found 3 more photographs from the same location. Each had been taken minutes apart. In one image, Emily stood outside the lobby. She appeared to be reading a folded piece of paper. She was alone. In the next photograph, a tall man walked toward her. His face was partially turned away from the camera. The final photograph was the most unsettling. Emily and the man were standing only a few feet apart. Neither appeared angry. Neither appeared frightened. They looked familiar. Not like strangers meeting for the first time. Almost as if they expected to see each other. No one else appeared in the frame. Not even Daniel. The back of each photograph contained Michael's handwriting. Most simply listed locations and dates. But beneath the final image, investigators found a sentence written in blue ink. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It wasn't signed. Read. She still hasn't decided whether to tell him. For the first time since the case was reopened, detectives seriously considered the possibility that Emily had been hiding something from everyone around her. Not necessarily a crime. A decision. The sentence on the back of the photograph suggested an ongoing conversation, not a chance encounter. The obvious question was impossible to ignore. Who was him? Daniel? Or someone else? The handwriting was compared to the mailbox application. The same forensic examiner reached a qualified conclusion. The lettering was highly consistent. Not enough for absolute certainty, but enough to believe both documents had probably been written by Michael Harlan. Investigators laid out everything they knew on a timeline. Emily had exchanged several late-night calls with a payphone outside the mailbox business. Someone using the name Michael Harlan rented a mailbox nearby. Emily had been photographed with a tall man matching Harlan's description before she disappeared. That same man had apparently taken multiple photographs of the honeymoon resort. Yet there was still no evidence explaining how they had met. Detectives turned their attention to Emily's life before the wedding. They requested personnel files from the dental practice where she had worked. The office had changed ownership twice since 1994, but many employee records had been preserved in storage. Performance reviews, emergency contact forms, vacation requests. Nothing unusual. Then an investigator noticed a stack of appointment books. Unlike patient records, which had been destroyed years earlier under retention policies, the scheduling books had survived because they contained only initials and appointment times. Emily's handwriting filled much of the margins. She often made notes for herself. Call supplier. Birthday card. Order gloves. Most were ordinary. One note, written 6 weeks before the wedding, stood out. MH called again. After 6. There was no last name. No phone number. Just 2 initials. The initials alone proved nothing. But they fit too neatly to ignore. Detectives interviewed Emily's former co-workers. Most remembered her as organized and friendly. One hygienist recalled that Emily occasionally stepped outside to take personal calls. That wasn't unusual. The office had only one phone line. Employees often used the payphone across the street for private conversations. Then the hygienist remembered something else. There was a man who came by once. She closed her eyes for a moment. Tall. Really tall. She couldn't remember his face. Only that he never came inside. Emily had gone out to meet him in the parking lot. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. When she returned, she looked distracted for the rest of the afternoon. She never mentioned his name. No one had thought it was important. Investigators searched visitor logs from nearby businesses. Nothing. Too much time had passed. Most records no longer existed. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Michael Harlan's brother called the detectives back. I found another box. Unlike the others, this one wasn't filled with photographs. It contained travel receipts, road maps, motel brochures, and several spiral notebooks. Michael had apparently used them as mileage logs for work. Most entries were brief. Date. Cities visited. Fuel purchases. Nothing personal. Then the entries changed during the summer of 1994. July 2nd. GR 7:30 p.m. July 6th. She almost told him today. July 11th. No answer at the apartment. July 15th. Wedding tomorrow. There were no names. No explanations. Just short observations. The notebook skipped July 16th entirely. The next entry was dated July 17th. It contained only a location. South Overlook. Waited 48 minutes. Detectives immediately thought of the lighthouse. Richard Miller had estimated that nearly 45 minutes passed before Emily returned to claim the photo album. Michael's notebook said 48. The numbers were close enough to be unsettling. The final entry appeared on July 18th. Unlike the others, it covered almost half a page. Several lines had been crossed out with a black marker. Forensic imaging recovered only fragments. She changed. Not safe. Bridge. Couldn't. The rest remained unreadable. No destination. No names. No explanation. Investigators returned to the honeymoon route once again. This time they focused on every bridge Emily and Daniel could have crossed between the resort and the lighthouse. There were 7. 1, an aging steel bridge over the Platte River, had been undergoing repairs in July 1994. Traffic had been reduced to 1 lane. Construction reports listed every contractor on site that weekend. Most workers had been interviewed back then. One had not. His name appeared only because he had replaced another employee during the Sunday morning shift. He had never been identified in the original investigation. He was now living in northern Wisconsin. When detectives knocked on his door nearly 2 decades later, he immediately recognized Emily's face before they said a word. I've wondered if someone would come ask me about her. The room fell silent. He explained that he had seen a young pregnant woman standing alone near the closed section of the bridge early on the morning of July 18th. She wasn't trying to cross. She kept looking at the river, then back toward the highway as if she was waiting for someone. He almost walked over to ask if she needed help. Before he could, a dark blue sedan pulled onto the shoulder. Not a pickup. Not Daniel's white Cavalier. A sedan. The driver never got out. Emily walked to the passenger side. She leaned into the open window. They spoke for less than a minute. Then she stepped back. The sedan drove away. Emily remained standing exactly where she was. The construction worker watched for another 30 seconds before a supervisor called him back to the job. When he looked again, she was gone. He assumed she had walked toward the parking area. He never reported what he saw. At the time, no one had connected the missing woman on the news with the woman at the bridge. He believed it was simply a coincidence. Before detectives left, they asked him one final question. "Do you remember anything about the driver?" The man nodded slowly. "I never saw the face." He paused. "But I remember the license plate." He walked into another room and returned with a faded pocket calendar from 1994. "I wrote it down because the car was parked where construction vehicles were supposed to be." He opened to July 18th. In the margin, beside a list of work hours, was a Michigan license plate number written in pencil. The registration did not belong to Michael Harlan. It belonged to a woman named Patricia Lawson. And according to every official record in the case, Patricia Lawson had never been interviewed. Detectives expected Patricia Lawson to be difficult to find. Instead, they located her within a day. She was 61 years old and living outside Lansing. She answered the door herself. When investigators introduced themselves and mentioned Emily Carter, her expression changed before either detective finished the sentence. She looked past them toward the driveway, then quietly asked if they wanted coffee. The interview lasted almost 4 hours. Patricia admitted she had owned the blue sedan in 1994. She remembered driving through the construction zone that July. But she insisted she had never met Emily. When detectives placed the bridge worker's statement in front of her, she read it twice. "I don't know why he'd say that." Her voice remained steady. Then they showed her the license plate written in the pocket calendar. She stopped talking. For nearly 20 seconds no one spoke. Finally, Patricia pushed the paper back across the table. "That's my car." It was the first thing she admitted without qualification. She explained that she worked as a pharmaceutical sales representative and spent most weekdays driving across Michigan. She often couldn't remember where she had been on a particular date. 19 years was a long time. Detectives accepted that. Then they asked a simple question. "Did you know Michael Harlan?" Patricia looked genuinely surprised. "I worked with him." The room went quiet again. She explained that they had been employed by different companies but covered many of the same territories. They frequently crossed paths at gas stations, diners, and motels. Sometimes they shared coffee. Sometimes they exchanged customer leads. Nothing more. She described Michael as quiet, polite, always carrying a camera, always writing things down. When shown the photograph of Emily standing beside the payphone, Patricia leaned closer. "I've seen this before." Neither detective interrupted. She pointed to the corner of the picture. "The map she's holding." She explained that both she and Michael had picked up identical tourist maps from a highway welcome center that summer. Thousands of visitors probably had. It seemed insignificant. Then Patricia noticed something no one else had mentioned. The map wasn't folded the way tourists usually folded it. It had been folded into 4 narrow sections. She smiled faintly. Michael always folded maps like that. One detective frowned. Always. He hated opening the whole thing while driving. That detail raised an uncomfortable possibility. If Emily was holding the map the way Michael habitually folded his, she may not have been carrying her own map. She may have been holding his. Detectives asked Patricia if she had ever met Emily. She hesitated, then answered carefully. "I don't think so." It wasn't a denial. It wasn't confirmation either. Before leaving, investigators requested permission to search boxes of old work documents Patricia still kept in her basement. She agreed. Most contained expense reports and sales catalogs. Near the bottom of one box sat a thick 1994 desk calendar. Appointments filled nearly every page. Client visits, mileage, hotel names, lunch meetings. July 17th contained one entry written in blue ink. 10:30, MH+E. Nothing else. No surname. No location. Just 3 characters. The detectives looked at Patricia. She rubbed her forehead. "I honestly don't remember who it was." The calendar was taken into evidence. Handwriting experts confirmed the entry had not been added later. It was original. Investigators began reconstructing Michael Harlan's work schedule. Unlike police records, his employer had archived mileage reimbursement forms. Every town he claimed to visit. Every overnight stay. Every fuel purchase. One receipt immediately stood out. July 17, 1994. 11:42 a.m. A restaurant less than 5 miles from the lighthouse. The same area where Richard Miller had found Emily's wedding album. Detectives visited the restaurant. It was still operating under the same family ownership. The current owner called his father, who had managed the business in 1994. The elderly man arrived carrying a faded box of memorabilia. Old menus. Newspaper clippings. Employee photographs. Then he produced something no one expected. A bulletin board photo taken during the summer of 1994. The picture showed waitresses celebrating a birthday inside the restaurant. Customers appeared in the background. Most were blurred. One table near the window was unusually clear. 3 people sat together. A tall man. A woman with shoulder-length brown hair. And another woman whose back faced the camera. Detectives enlarged the image. The tall man resembled Michael Harlan. The woman facing the camera strongly resembled Emily. The third person remained unidentified. Patricia Lawson denied it was her. Facial recognition software wasn't useful. The resolution was too poor. Still, one detail emerged. The unidentified woman wore a company name badge clipped to her jacket. The logo had faded almost completely. Image analysts spent several days enhancing the photograph. They recovered only 5 readable letters. Mercy. Investigators searched hospitals first. Nothing matched. Then one detective remembered a regional home healthcare company that had operated during the 1990s. Its name began with the same word. The business had merged years earlier, but employment records survived. Among hundreds of former staff members, one employee immediately drew attention. Her name appeared in Michael Harlan's address book. She had also listed Patricia Lawson as a professional reference on a job application filed in 1995. And buried inside Emily Carter's original case file was a single interview note from August 1994. Just 3 lines long. A detective had spoken to the woman by telephone because someone anonymously suggested she might know Emily. The note ended with one sentence. Caller stated she has never heard of Emily Carter. No further follow-up. The report was signed. But something about it seemed wrong. The interviewing detective had carefully documented every conversation in the case. Every interview contained 2 or 3 pages of notes. This one contained only 63 words. And there was no audio tape. No witness statement. No date of birth. No address verification. Nothing to prove the detective had actually spoken to the woman whose name appeared on the report. The detective who wrote the report had retired in 2002. He was 83 now and living in a small town outside Saginaw. He agreed to meet investigators but warned them that his memory was unreliable. When they placed the 1-page interview report in front of him, he adjusted his glasses and frowned. I don't remember this. That alone wasn't unusual. He had worked hundreds of missing person cases. Then he looked at the signature. That's mine. He turned the page over. I wouldn't have ended an interview like this. He explained that he always documented how he reached a witness. Home phone. Work phone. In person. Someone else's residence. That information was missing. So were his initials in the upper right corner, something he routinely added after reviewing a report. I must have been interrupted, he said. Then he stopped. No. He read the page again. I don't think I wrote the narrative. The room fell silent. He pointed at one sentence. Caller stated she has never heard of Emily Carter. I never used the word caller, unless the person contacted us first. According to the case log, detectives had supposedly initiated the interview. If that was true, the wording made no sense. A forensic examination of the original report found something even stranger. The signature matched the detective's. The typed text had been produced on a different typewriter than every other report generated by his office that month. In 1994, the department still used mechanical typewriters for witness summaries. Nearly every detective had been assigned one. The letters left microscopic impressions unique to each machine. This report came from a typewriter that belonged to no one in the department. No record explained why. The witness was located 3 days later. Her name was Linda Mercer. She had retired from home healthcare and was living in Toledo, Ohio. When detectives introduced themselves, she looked confused. Emily Carter meant nothing to her. At least initially. Then they showed her the enlarged restaurant photograph. Linda leaned forward. That's me. She pointed to the third person at the table. I remember this lunch. The detectives exchanged a glance. She studied the image another few seconds. I knew Michael. She pointed at him. We were friends. Then she looked at Emily. I don't know her name. She paused. But I met her. Linda explained that Michael had asked her to join them for lunch because he wanted a second opinion about something. She couldn't remember exactly what. Only that the conversation felt tense. Emily did very little talking. Michael seemed frustrated. At one point he slid a sealed envelope across the table. Emily didn't open it. She simply placed it inside her purse. Detectives asked what was inside. I have no idea. Linda shook her head. I never asked. Then she remembered something else. As they stood to leave, Michael said a sentence that had stayed with her for years, though she never understood it. "If you wait until Monday, it'll be too late." Emily didn't answer. She simply walked outside. Linda watched through the restaurant window as Emily stood alone beside a payphone for several minutes. Then a white Chevrolet Cavalier pulled into the parking lot. Emily got inside. Michael remained where he was, watching the car leave. The account fit almost perfectly with the timeline investigators had been building, but it introduced a new problem. If Emily had returned to Daniel after lunch, why had she never mentioned meeting Michael? Or the envelope? Detectives asked Linda why she had denied knowing Emily in 1994. She looked genuinely puzzled. "I didn't." They showed her the old interview report. She read it slowly. "I never spoke to the police." She looked back up. "Nobody ever called me." Telephone company archives no longer existed. There was no way to prove whether the interview had occurred. But if Linda was telling the truth, someone had created a false witness report and placed it inside the investigation. The question was no longer whether mistakes had been made. Someone had actively redirected the case. Investigators reopened every document connected to the first 6 weeks of the disappearance. An evidence technician noticed a numbering gap. Every piece of physical evidence had been assigned a sequential property number. Box 14 ended with item 143. Box 15 began with item 145. There was no item 144. No description. No transfer sheet. No disposal record. Just a missing number. Property logs from 1994 identified item 144 with only 3 handwritten words before the line had been crossed out in black ink. Brown envelope. Everything after those words had been obscured. Infrared imaging recovered 2 additional words beneath the ink. From bride. No one knew what had been inside it. No inventory had survived. The evidence custodian who maintained the property room in 1994 had died years earlier. His replacement remembered hearing rumors about missing paperwork after a basement flood in the late 1990s, but no official investigation had ever followed. Detectives searched the storage shelves one final time. Most boxes had been opened dozens of times over the years. One had not. It sat behind a row of old training materials covered in dust. The label had faded almost completely. Inside were miscellaneous items returned from the Honeymoon resort after the initial search. A hotel brochure. A room key sleeve. 2 unused postcards. A plastic souvenir lighthouse. At the bottom lay a small, unmarked manila envelope. It had never been logged into evidence. It had never been opened. The adhesive flap was still sealed. Written across the front in blue ballpoint ink were 6 words. "Open only if I'm missing." The evidence technician photographed the envelope before anyone touched it. There was no case number. No evidence sticker. No initials from an officer. It had somehow spent 19 years inside police storage without ever becoming part of the official record. The flap was sealed with old yellowing adhesive. No sign suggested it had been opened and resealed. Detectives requested a court order before breaking the seal. The approval came the following morning. A forensic examiner wore fresh gloves and carefully lifted the flap. Inside were 3 items. A folded letter. A motel stationery sheet. And a 35mm film negative sealed in a small plastic sleeve. The negative immediately drew attention. Everyone had assumed Emily's disposable camera had disappeared with her. Yet here was a single frame that had apparently been removed before the roll was developed. The letter came first. It was handwritten. Every page was compared to samples from Emily's employment records. The writing matched. The opening line was direct. "If you're reading this, something happened before I could explain." The room fell silent. The rest of the letter contained no accusations. No names. Only fragments. Emily wrote that someone from before Daniel had unexpectedly returned to her life several months earlier. She admitted she had made a terrible mistake by agreeing to meet him. She claimed she had hidden those meetings because she believed they would stop once she got married. Instead they continued. One sentence immediately stood out. "He says someone else could be hurt if I tell the truth." The letter never explained what truth, or who might be hurt. Near the end, Emily mentioned the envelope itself. "I don't know if I'm overreacting. Maybe I'll throw this away before we leave." She never did. The final paragraph was unfinished. The last sentence ended halfway across the page. There was no signature. No farewell. Just an incomplete thought. Investigators turned to the motel stationery. It contained only 4 handwritten words. Room 214. Midnight. Alone. No date. No explanation. The handwriting did not match Emily's. It didn't match Daniel's either. The film negative was sent to a specialist laboratory. Hours later, the first digital scan appeared on a monitor. It showed a motel room. Room 214. Emily had taken the photograph from near the bathroom doorway. Daniel was sitting on the edge of the bed. He wasn't looking at the camera. He appeared to be reading a folded document. Across from him stood a second person. Only part of the body appeared in frame. A denim jacket. One arm. A hand resting on the back of a chair. The face had been cut off by the edge of the image. Detectives enlarged the document Daniel was holding. The text remained unreadable. But one feature became obvious. The paper had a dark rectangular border. It wasn't a road map. It wasn't a brochure. It resembled a legal document or a certificate. No one could identify it. The negative contained edge markings indicating it had been exposed immediately before the honeymoon photographs. That meant someone had physically removed this single frame from the roll before the remaining pictures were developed. Someone had decided this image should never be seen. The discovery transformed the investigation. Until now, detectives had treated Michael Harlan as the central mystery. Now they had evidence placing an unidentified visitor inside the couple's motel room. And Daniel had never mentioned that anyone visited them. Investigators returned to the resort. The current owner had preserved decades of reservation records after purchasing the property. Most guest registration cards from 1994 still existed. Room 214 belonged to Daniel and Emily. The room next door, 216, had been occupied by a retired couple from Ohio. Room 212 had been vacant. Then one detective noticed a handwritten note attached to the reservation sheet. Extra key issued. 7:42 p.m. There was no guest name beside the request. Only an employee's initials. The employee had died in 2008. The note had never been referenced in the original investigation. The detectives reconstructed the evening of July 17 minute by minute. Dinner ended around 6:30. A witness saw Emily near the dock shortly after 7. The front desk issued an extra room key at 7:42. The call from room 214 reached the front desk at 9:47. Sometime after midnight, according to the note found inside the envelope, someone was expected in the room. The unanswered question was becoming increasingly specific. Who had used the extra key? The answer appeared unexpectedly 2 weeks later. A locksmith in Traverse City contacted investigators after seeing the reopened case on television. He had worked part-time at the resort during the summer of 1994. "I don't remember the guests," he said. "But I remember the key." He explained that issuing an extra key wasn't unusual. Losing one happened all the time. What made this request memorable was who asked for it. It wasn't the bride. It wasn't the groom. It was another employee. A woman from housekeeping. She claimed the couple had accidentally locked themselves out. The locksmith made the duplicate and handed it to her. Detectives immediately checked the employee roster. 32 housekeeping staff had worked at the resort that summer. 31 had already been identified in the original case. One personnel file was missing. Not misplaced. Gone. Payroll records confirmed she had worked there. Tax records confirmed she had been paid. But her application, emergency contact form, and hiring documents had disappeared. Only her name remained on an old weekly schedule. Carol Whitmore. No interview. No statement. No follow-up. Nothing. The original detectives had never spoken to the one employee who requested access to room 214 on the night before Emily vanished. 3 days later, investigators finally located Carol Whitmore in New Mexico. She was 70 years old. When they identified themselves over the phone, she interrupted before they could ask their first question. "I've been expecting this call," she said quietly. Then she added a sentence that no one in the room was prepared to hear. "I didn't give that key to housekeeping. I gave it to Emily." Carol Whitmore agreed to speak only if the interview was recorded from the beginning. She said she had carried the memory for years. "I figured nobody would ever ask." The detectives asked why she had requested the extra key. Carol didn't hesitate. "Emily asked me to." According to Carol, Emily approached her outside the laundry room shortly after dinner on July 17. She seemed nervous, not frightened. She kept looking over her shoulder as they spoke. Emily explained that she needed an extra room key because she planned to leave something in the room for someone who would arrive later. Carol assumed it was a surprise for her husband. People on honeymoons did unusual things. She thought nothing of it. The detectives showed her the note found inside the sealed envelope. Room 214. Midnight. Alone. Carol stared at it. "That's not Emily's handwriting." She was certain. Then she added another detail. When I handed her the key, she wasn't alone. A man stood about 20 yards away near the ice machine. Tall. Baseball cap. Hands in his pockets. Carol couldn't see his face. She remembered him because he never took his eyes off Emily. She assumed he was another guest. Investigators asked the obvious question. Was it Daniel? No. She answered immediately. It definitely wasn't her husband. Carol believed Emily slipped the extra key into the pocket of her light jacket. That jacket was never recovered. Then Carol said something that had never appeared in any report. Emily asked me what time my shift ended. Carol told her 11. Emily nodded. Then asked whether anyone would be working the front desk after midnight. Carol remembered laughing. There was always someone. At the time, the question sounded harmless. Now they suggested Emily was planning a meeting after everyone else had gone to bed. The detectives asked whether she had seen Emily again. Carol closed her eyes. Once. Around 11:45 p.m., she was walking through the parking lot toward her car. She noticed a light on in room 214. The curtains weren't fully closed. As she passed, she glanced toward the window. She expected to see the newlyweds. Instead, she saw 3 people. Daniel, Emily, and the tall man. They weren't fighting. That surprised the detectives. What were they doing? Sitting. Carol demonstrated with her hands. They were all sitting around the little table. She remembered because the arrangement looked strange. No one was eating. No television. No laughter. They appeared to be talking. Calmly. She couldn't hear a word. The image lasted only a few seconds before she continued to her car. She never mentioned it because no one ever asked whether anyone had visited the room. Until now, investigators had assumed the unidentified man had met Emily in secret. Carol's account suggested something very different. Daniel may have been present. If true, then his repeated statement that no one visited room 214 that night was false. Detectives flew to Arizona. Daniel agreed to another interview. It was the 7th time he had spoken with investigators. They placed 3 photographs on the table. The gas station, the lighthouse, the motel negative. Then they handed him Carol Whitmore's statement. He read every page. When he finished, he folded the papers neatly. For almost a minute he said nothing. Finally he looked at the lead detective. I wondered when somebody would find her. The detective didn't respond. Daniel continued. I mean Carol. It was the first time he had acknowledged knowing her name. The interview room became noticeably quieter. You told investigators in 1994 that nobody visited your room. I know. That wasn't true. Daniel nodded once. No. It was the first major contradiction he had ever admitted. He leaned back in his chair. I lied. The detective asked why. Daniel stared at the table. Because I thought it would ruin everything. What would? Our families. He took a slow breath. The marriage. The investigation. My life. The detective waited. Daniel continued without being prompted. The man came to the room. He pointed at the motel photograph. That's him. Michael Harlan? I didn't know his last name. But yes. According to Daniel, the knock came shortly before midnight. Emily answered the door before he could. She looked shocked. Not because Michael had appeared. Because she hadn't expected him to come there. Daniel said Michael asked if they could talk privately. Emily refused. Instead, she invited him inside. The 3 of them sat around the table. Exactly as Carol had described. Daniel claimed Michael placed a large manila envelope on the table. Emily immediately pushed it back toward him. Neither detective interrupted. Daniel continued. She kept saying she didn't want it. What was inside? I never looked. You never asked? I asked. He looked up. She told me it wasn't mine. That sentence hung in the room. Daniel said Michael eventually stood to leave. Before walking out, he looked directly at Emily. Then said one sentence. You have until morning. The detectives recognized it immediately. It echoed Linda Mercer's memory from the restaurant. If you wait until Monday, it'll be too late. The wording was different. The message wasn't. Something was supposed to happen by morning. Daniel admitted he argued with Emily after Michael left. Not because she had met another man. Because she refused to explain who he was. According to Daniel, she cried for nearly an hour. Around 2 in the morning, she finally fell asleep. When I woke up. He stopped. The detectives had heard this part before. She was gone. But then Daniel said something he had never told anyone. I found a note. The detective's pen stopped moving. A note. Daniel nodded. It was on the nightstand. What did it say? I don't remember every word. Tell us what you do remember. Daniel closed his eyes. It said. He spoke slowly. Don't come looking for me. The detectives immediately asked where the note was. I burned it. Why? Because I believed her. He looked exhausted. I honestly thought she had chosen to leave. The lead detective slid one final photograph across the table. It was the image of Emily standing beside the payphone. In 19 years, he asked quietly, why didn't you ever tell anyone about Michael? Daniel looked at the photograph for several seconds. Then he answered with a sentence that redirected the entire case once again. Because Michael wasn't the person Emily was afraid of. He pushed the photograph back. She was terrified of the person who sent him. The interview ended 23 minutes later. Not because detectives were finished. Because Daniel asked for an attorney. Until that moment he had answered every question. Now he had introduced an entirely new person into the investigation and refused to say another word. Outside the interview room, detectives reviewed the recording. One sentence stood out. He hadn't said Michael was threatening Emily. He hadn't even implied it. He had described Michael as someone carrying a message. That distinction mattered. The task force shifted its focus again. If Michael had been acting on someone else's behalf, who had that authority over him? Investigators returned to Michael Harlan's notebooks. This time they ignored every reference to Emily. Instead they searched for patterns. The same initials appeared over and over. M. L. And one that no one had paid attention to before. R. Sometimes the entries were only a few words. R. Changed meeting. R. Called motel. Waiting for R. The initials appeared 14 times over 3 months. There was no surname. No phone number. Nothing identifying the person. A forensic accountant was asked to reconstruct Michael's finances. His bank records had survived on microfilm. The deposits matched his salary. Mostly. Every few weeks, another cash deposit appeared. Always between $1,800 and $2,500. No explanation. No employer reimbursement. No record of freelance work. Over 6 months, the unexplained deposits totaled nearly $19,000. For a traveling sales representative in 1994, it was a substantial amount. Detectives subpoenaed the records of the bank where the deposits were made. Most surveillance had long since been destroyed. Deposit slips had not. Nearly every cash deposit had been completed by hand. The handwriting matched Michael's. But one slip contained something different. Under source, most people simply wrote cash. Michael had written a single word. Consulting. His employer had no record of outside consulting work. Former co-workers laughed when investigators asked. Michael wasn't that kind of guy. He hated dealing with people. He barely liked meetings. No one believed he had a side business. One retired co-worker remembered something else. Michael sometimes disappeared for an hour during work trips. When asked where he'd been, he always gave the same answer. Taking pictures. No one questioned it. He always had a camera around his neck. Detectives wondered whether photography had simply been a convenient excuse. Another search warrant was issued. This time for Michael's storage locker. Thomas Harlan had emptied most of it after his brother's death, but one section remained sealed because of unpaid rental fees before the account closed. The contents had eventually been transferred to county surplus storage. Most of the boxes contained office supplies, old tires, camping equipment. At the back sat a dented gray filing cabinet. Locked. The locksmith drilled it open. Inside were hanging folders arranged alphabetically. Insurance papers, vehicle registrations, tax returns. Nothing unusual. Then investigators reached a folder labeled Only, 1994. It contained no financial records. Only photographs. Hundreds of them. Not landscapes. Not tourist attractions. People. Nearly every image had been taken from a distance. Outside grocery stores. Parking lots. Gas stations. Office buildings. Most subjects appeared unaware they were being photographed. On the back of many prints were dates and times. Some included addresses. Several names had been written in blue ink. The collection resembled surveillance. One detective carefully turned another photograph over. The back read, Emily Carter. Front entrance. 7:42 p.m. July 17th. Another. Daniel Carter. Lobby. 11:18 p.m. Another. Carol Whitmore. Laundry entrance. 11:31 p.m. The timestamps aligned almost perfectly with Carol's statement. Michael hadn't simply been taking pictures. He had been documenting movements. Every person connected to room 214 appeared to have been watched. Then investigators found something they hadn't expected. A photograph of Patricia Lawson, taken outside a motel nearly 2 weeks before the wedding. On the back, delivered package. Another showed Linda Mercer leaving the restaurant. The note beneath it read, "Witness present. Unexpected." The room fell silent. Whoever Michael worked for had been monitoring multiple people long before the honeymoon. The final folder contained only one photograph. It was different from all the others. It wasn't taken secretly. The subject was looking directly into the camera. A man in his late 50s. Gray suit. White shirt. No tie. Standing outside an office building. On the back, written in larger letters than any other note, were 4 words. "Do not photograph again." There was no name. No date. Only an address. The office building still stood in Grand Rapids. Today it housed a law firm. In 1994, county business records showed something else occupied the second floor. A small private investigation company. It had dissolved in 1997. The owner had died. Most employment records were gone. But annual licensing files remained with the state. Investigators reviewed the list of licensed investigators. One name immediately caught their attention. Michael Harlan. Not as an employee. As a contract investigator. His license had been active for just 11 months. It expired 6 weeks after Emily disappeared. No renewal application was ever filed. The discovery explained the photographs. It explained the surveillance. It explained why Michael had been documenting people so methodically. But it raised a far more important question. Who had hired him? The firm's surviving billing ledgers had been water-damaged years earlier. Most client names were unreadable. Only fragments remained. One page from July 1994 was in better condition than the rest. 3 invoices had survived. The first 2 listed corporate clients. The third had been partially burned along one edge. The client name was missing. The amount billed remained visible. $19,000. Exactly the total of the unexplained cash deposits into Michael's account. At the bottom of the invoice was a reference number. Case 144. The same number that had vanished from the police evidence log. The detectives stared at the page. For 19 years, they had assumed item 144 in the evidence room was simply a missing envelope. Now the number appeared somewhere else entirely. Not as evidence. As a private investigation case. And for the first time, they had reason to believe that whoever paid Michael $19,000 knew about Emily long before she vanished, and may have known exactly why she never came home. The discovery of the invoice changed everything. 4 weeks, detectives chased every surviving record connected to the private investigation firm. Most had been destroyed. The office had closed decades earlier. Its computers had been discarded. Paper files had been shredded after the owner's death. Only fragments remained. One retired office manager remembered a company policy that seemed insignificant at the time. Every client was assigned a numbered file. When a case was completed, the physical file was placed into long-term storage before eventually being destroyed. Except for one copy. A duplicate summary was always mailed to the client. If that summary still existed, it wouldn't be in the firm's records. It would be wherever the client had kept it. The problem was obvious. No one knew who the client was. The burned invoice had erased the name. Investigators spent months reconstructing it through bank deposits, tax filings, and accounting records. Eventually, one payment surfaced. Not from a corporation. Not from a law office. Not from an insurance company. It came from a family trust. The trust had only one active trustee in 1994. A man named Robert Ellison. He had died in 2007. His children insisted they had never heard of Emily Carter. At first, detectives believed they were telling the truth. Then one daughter mentioned an old safe in the basement of her father's lake house. It had not been opened since his death. Inside were property deeds, stock certificates, family photographs, and a sealed manila envelope. Across the front were 3 typed words. Case 144 Summary. The detectives opened it expecting answers. Instead, they found another surprise. There was no investigation report. Only a cover letter. It stated that the complete file had been hand-delivered on July 15, 1994. One day before Emily's wedding. The report itself was gone. Only the transmittal letter remained. But attached to it was a carbon copy of a receipt acknowledging delivery. The signature at the bottom belonged to Robert Ellison. And beneath it, in blue ink, someone had written a short note. Destroy after Monday. No one ever did. Investigators dug into Robert Ellison's life. He had owned several commercial properties across western Michigan. He served on charitable boards. He donated to churches. He had never been arrested. His name had never appeared anywhere in Emily's original case. Then detectives found a connection so ordinary it had escaped everyone. Emily's father had worked for one of Ellison's construction companies for 11 months in the late 1980s. Nothing suggested they remained close. Nothing suggested a friendship. Just an old employment record. Still, it was enough to reopen dozens of forgotten interviews. One retired foreman remembered Emily as a little girl. Another recalled that Robert occasionally visited job sites. No one remembered anything unusual. It felt like another dead end. Then Emily's mother asked detectives to return one final box that had been stored in the evidence room for 19 years. She wanted to bring her daughter's belongings home. Inside were ordinary things. A sweater. A paperback novel. Travel brochures. A small jewelry pouch. As she unpacked the box, something slipped from between the pages of the novel. A folded grocery receipt. No one had noticed it before. On the back in Emily's handwriting was a list. Milk, bread, film, call mom. At the very bottom, squeezed into the remaining space, was one sentence. Not a reminder. Not a shopping note. A sentence. If anything happens, it started long before the honeymoon. Her mother sat quietly for several minutes. She traced the handwriting with her thumb. Then she looked at the lead detective. She knew. It wasn't an accusation. It was the realization every parent dreads. Emily had been carrying a burden she never shared. The task force officially concluded that Emily's disappearance had not been random. She had been meeting with Michael Harlan before the wedding. Michael had been working for an unidentified client. Someone had paid nearly $19,000 to monitor Emily, Daniel, and several other people connected to her. Critical evidence had disappeared. A witness interview had apparently been fabricated. An envelope had never been logged. And somewhere between midnight and sunrise on July 18, 1994, Emily vanished. No physical evidence ever proved she was murdered. No evidence ever proved she left voluntarily. No remains were found. No confirmed sightings ever emerged. Daniel was never charged. Michael died 4 years after the disappearance. Most of the people capable of answering the remaining questions were gone. The investigation remained open. Every few years, detectives reviewed it again. Every few years, another small clue surfaced. Never enough. Always one piece short. Emily's parents died without knowing what happened to their daughter or the grandchild they never met. Daniel never remarried. He continued placing fresh flowers beside a small stone overlooking Lake Michigan every July. He never told anyone exactly why he chose that spot. Melissa kept the wedding album. She refused to replace the mysterious photograph. She said it belonged exactly where it had been found. As a reminder that the smallest overlooked detail can change an entire investigation. Today, the official file on Emily Carter fills dozens of boxes. Thousands of pages. Hundreds of photographs. Countless interviews. It begins with a missing bride on her honeymoon. It ends with a sealed envelope, a missing report, a vanished investigation file, and a truth that came close enough to touch, but never close enough to hold. And after everything investigators uncovered over 19 years, one question still remains. Who was Robert Ellison trying to protect?